Last week we did the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement of the 18th century, which had such an influence even on the Episcopal Church, if you read our hymnal, which derives in such large measure from the original work that John and especially Charles Wesley did to create a hymnody that would be good for God's people, and then moved into church, which Anglicans had not done before that. Today, we're moving a century into the 19th century, and the so-called Oxford movement in England, which was between roughly 1833 and 1860, in the heart of the century. The Oxford movement gave rise to the kind of churchmanship that we have here at St. Luke's. We could not be doing the things that we do in the 10 o'clock Eucharist if it were not for the Oxford movement. So while it is different from what we are now in many respects, it is very, very influential in our common life. The Oxford, it's also known as the Tractarian movement in the 19th century, was the beginning of a major renewal of Catholic ideals and practices in the Church of England and in many other Anglican churches worldwide. What one now thinks as High Church or Anglo-Catholic would be the ritual and ceremonial and aesthetic components of worship. But those were somewhat later developments, chiefly focused in Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, not the University of Oxford. Many of those objectives clearly show elements that participated in what was called the Romantic movement of the 19th century. In this case, the movement in religion, the value of mystery, of symbol, of connectedness with God, somehow participating in God's own life. The church, the reality of the corporate, not only the individual, even the connection with the whole cosmos. The Oxford movement participated in all of that in its own distinctive way. It overruled the Reformation's rejection of the Middle Ages, of the religion of the Middle Ages. It opened the way to recovering the music, hymnody, and prayer that had been destroyed by English Protestants. In the very beginning, however, the Oxford movement was not concerned with ritual or aesthetics, but with the integrity of the church's faith. It even dared, kind of intentionally, obnoxiously, to use the word dogma as a positive term over against the whole tendencies that the churches have been undergoing during the 18th century. To me, there clearly are so-called romantic elements from the first, that whole movement that pushed back against the Enlightenment, an effort to overcome the secularity and the individualism and the hyper-rationalism of the 18th century Enlightenment, the way that it had, in their view, in the view of the Oxford movement, shrunk human life, and the Enlightenment's hostility to theology and mystery and authority and tradition. The members of the Tractarian movement, the Oxford movement, the authentic center of the Christian faith, could not survive if those solvents were not withstood more vigorously than rationalist Protestants and evangelicals could possibly do. Further, in the view of these Oxford theologians, these Oxford professors, in the view of the Oxford movement, the Church of England had to recover not only from the 18th century, but from the 16th century, from the Protestant Reformation. It was the Protestant reformers, Luther and Zwingli, the Oxford movement thought, who had introduced subjective private individual judgment as the final criterion of religious truth. It's what you thought that was true. That led straight to the wild rationalist wilderness, and finally, they thought, to atheism. It had assaulted the objectivity of the church, the Reformation had. But no matter who was the real villain, John Henry Newman, like the poet S.T. Coleridge, was concerned to bring back together what Enlightenment logical razors had separated and Protestant destructiveness had put a death to, or tried to. The intellect and moral sense on one side, which the Enlightenment had put all of its money into, and the intellect, the reason, and the moral sense attached to the reason, and then the affections of the heart, which the Enlightenment had no time for at all. Those Newman and other members of the Oxford movement wanted to bring back together. The same thing with the individual, which was the great watchword of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, and the corporate, the actual reality that groups weren't just a gathering of individuals to agree with each other, but that there could be a reality in something corporate, like a country, like a people, like a church. To bring back the past and the present and the future, all three of them. The Enlightenment had little regard for the past and none whatever for tradition, simply the enemy of it. The Catholic revival among Anglicans, which is another way to talk about the Oxford movement, the Catholic revival among Anglicans would struggle against anyone, Protestant or atheist, who would seek to sunder things that God had united, as the Reformation and the Enlightenment had done, in their view. I should say, interjecting here now, that I'm taking the view of the Oxford movement in this session. This is always what I do when I teach. I look at from the inside of the particular movement that I'm looking at, as if to see how they see the world around them. It's not necessarily the way I see the world around me. So I want to make that clear. Although I have to say, in this particular case, that I've been deeply influenced both by the Wesleyan movement and by the Oxford movement in ways that are alive in me to this day. Circumstances in England, as seen by the Oxford movement Anglican clergy in the 1830s. First, and what bothered them the most, the domination of the Church of England by an increasingly secularized state government that used church for its own non-Christian purposes. The prime ministers were nominally members of the Church of England still, but had almost no comprehension of what really was going on in the Christian religion. They didn't care. They were politicians, and that's all that counted for them. Changes were being made, driven by purely secular ideals. Changes to the church were being made by Parliament, which included all kinds of views of things, and many of them unsympathetic with the church. Most governmental institutions, until this time, most governmental institutions in England, you could only participate in them if you were a member of the Church of England and received communion at least a couple of times a year. That was true in the Navy. That was true in the Parliament. In 1829, the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts opened the way to dissenters, so-called, to have full access to everything in England. Particularly, that meant Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists. As long as they were some kind of Christian, they could participate in government, they could join the Navy as an officer, they could do a lot of different things. The Catholic Relief Act in the same year and the Reform Act of 3 years later opened the way to Roman Catholics, not for full participation, but for all kinds of things that had been ruled out for them. A Roman Catholic population that was increasing enormously from Irish immigration to the industrial centers of the 19th century England. What really got their goat, the Oxford movement's goat, was that the Parliament had reshaped the whole Church of Ireland. The Church of Ireland is an Anglican church. The Parliament just rearranged dioceses, closed some, united some, moved them around the map one way or another without any reference.
That's Northern Ireland.
All of Ireland. At this point, the whole thing was still under the not very gentle government of England. They were reorganizing bishoprics on the basis of purely secular ideas. They were running the church without any real attention to what was going on religiously in matters of the spirit, on the basis of their own political interests and wholly non-apostolic authority. Apparently, the church, meaning in this case, restrictedly the clergy, the church had no real power and was in the trap of simply reflecting the secular nation, a nation that was feeling enormous changes in industrialization and urbanization, with an intelligentsia that had largely been lost to the church by this point, and more that was happening more and more rapidly, and a proletariat which was growing rapidly and not coming to church by and large, having had no churches really available to them in the new industrial centers. For Oxford movement members, this required a countervailing assertion that the church had apostolic authority. It resulted in a strongly anti-Constantinian move. Constantine was the great emperor of the 4th century who became a Christian and who then dominated the church, and that continued to be true, although for the rest of Western history. They were pushing back against that sort of domination of the church by the state, and thereby abandoning. They had mostly come from the High Church party in the Church of England, which was allied to the Tory party, the Conservative party in England, and they abandoned that. They were just not interested in having one side or another running the politics of the church. They wanted the church to be able to run its own apostolic business on the basis of apostolic authority.
Was Parliament funding the church at all at this point? Like, on what grounds did they have that?
No, the Parliament was not funding the church. They didn't have any grounds. They just ran it.
Oh.
The church lived off of the income from its lands almost exclusively. So there was real tension with the whole issue of church and state. They wanted still to influence the whole nation, to be the Church of England for everybody. But they wanted that to be a church that reflected the faith of the apostles and not the interests of some narrow-minded politicians. Secondly, the Oxford movement members diagnosed a fair amount of rot in the church itself. No sanctity, no sense of the holiness and otherness of God, no sense of the supernatural, no true interiority, Now, speaking for myself, that's a somewhat unfair verdict, but it was their verdict, and they felt it strongly. The church was in relative decline, and it was very weak against the solvents of modern thought. Anti-intellectualism, hold on. They criticized the evangelicals. Note here, evangelicals in the 19th century were not by any means allied with right-wing politics, the way it has come to be the case, just to a large extent here. That was not the case in England in the 19th century. Evangelicals were simply the heirs of the Wesleyan movement and of the Puritan movement before that in England. These were the heirs of Wesley who had remained in the Church of England and not separated with the Methodists. They were in relative decline. They were weak against the solvents of modernity. They were anti-intellectual. They had lost their conversation with the roots of the church and patristics in the Middle Ages. And they had critically narrowed the resources of Christianity by doing that. Intellectually, spiritually, and in just about every other way. They relied on scripture alone without any idea of what 1900 years of Christian reflection had done in relationship with the scriptures. Evangelicals used, for example, highly rationalist tools on the scriptures to find miracle stories that they took as evidences of the divine reality of the New Testament. One way you knew that Jesus' revelation was from God was all the miracles he had worked. Well, they used these as kind of evidences, and that's all a miracle really was to them, an evidence of divine revelation. That, again, critically narrowed the meaning of miracle. Obviously, and the Oxford movement knew this, obviously that was vulnerable to rationalist criticism, especially from Germany, as their analysis of the Christian religion was becoming more and more radical. And the broad church liberal wing of the church would be criticizing that whole approach, lock, stock, and barrel. Evangelicals further read scriptures in a very subjective way. They used their own private individual judgment as to what they would accept and focus on and what they would not. They had no kind of corporate authority or control on that, which could and easily did spin out of control into an infinite variety of denominations, so that each person deciding what was true for them in the Bible and wanting to have a denomination that suited them could end up having a separate denomination for every single individual in England. Each person, one man, one church, more or less. The Oxford movement also thought that the evangelicals didn't have a really true interiority. Faith meant only the conversion experience, an emotional and personal persuasion of the individual, which was open to rampant subjectivity and individualism with no necessary role for the corporate life of the church at all. If you've been converted, who needs a church? Evangelicals devalued the corporate, the objective, doctrine, the sacraments, the church. They could not really form culture or society from that kind of privatized piety. They could not withstand the acids of 19th century thought. Something stronger and deeper had to stand in the middle of England, to stand for something stronger and deeper than that. Then another major party in the Church of England that the Oxford movement really criticized was the rational liberalism of the Broad Church Party. The Christian effort, the rational liberalism of this party was a Christian effort to adopt the best of the Enlightenment, a spirit of the critical testing of everything by reason, including the moral outcome of anything anybody believed was true. Its watchwords were openness to the new, progress, enlightenment, rejection of a dead path, strict individualist logic to judge all things. And that meant getting rid of a fair part of Christianity in the view of the Oxford movement. What they considered a dead past was a huge part of the Christian religion. They paid no real attention to centers of the Christian religion, like the Incarnation and the Trinity. In the view of the High Church, such liberal Protestants diluted and dissolved basic elements of the gospel carried by church doctrine and were no more than halfway houses to sheer unbelief and eventually atheism. They had no sense of sin. They had no sense of redemption. They weren't attached to the Incarnation particularly, and they had no time particularly for the atonement. There was no sense of reality, of spiritual world, no sense of a call to personal or communal holiness. Since nothing corporate was real, a pure individualism was the only thing that could result from that. Then, while the Oxford movement members almost all came out, not all of them, but most of them came out of the old High Church Party in England, they were critical of it as well, though far less critical of it. They did not like the way it had been wed to the politics of conservative Tories. And they gave the appearance of powerless cultural survivals that weren't really actively involved in cultivating holiness of life. Privately, members of the Oxford movement sometimes referred to old High Church clergy as two bottle men, meaning that they get through bottles of port in one day. They weren't effective. They weren't serious about what they were doing, except to keep their privileges. However, and they were far, far, far too bound to the state, too uncritical of the Reformation as well. Yet in the view of the Oxford movement, the High Church was right in principle on many things. It understood the basics of Christianity, and it could show the way back to a church that had once had integrity and could have it again. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if there's questions of clarification. There'll be time for big questions coming up, but anything that I've gone through here that just scooted past? Stunned silence. So on to the formation of the Oxford movement itself. All the leaders of this movement, like John Henry Newman, were convinced together that the nation was on the wrong track and that a major crisis was looming with a spirit of atheism, which I think was true enough. Note the care for the whole nation that they had. Anything but fully authentic Anglican Catholic Christianity would simply prepare the way for defeat. There could be no help in alternatives or halfway houses. But the Church of England, for all of its defects and deformities, was still a branch of the Catholic Church, with the creeds, the sacraments, and holy orders in apostolic succession still intact. It found the center of its life in a triune God, in the Incarnation, The Oxford movement valued the apostles and the apostolic succession of bishops. They valued saints, which the Protestants and the liberals had just pretty much dismissed. They valued the sacraments as absolutely central to the life of the church. The Church of England was in organic continuity with the past all the way back to the apostles, and an organic communion with the living God in a way that was absolutely objective. Bishops were bishops because they had been ordained by bishops who had been ordained by bishops who had been ordained originally, the Oxford movement thought, by the apostles. The Church of England could split from its slavery to the state, could stand against the tendencies of the nation that were going the wrong way, and stand, and thereby make a difference to everyone. This kicked off in 1833 when John Keble, who was the professor of poetry at Oxford and a priest, preached a sermon entitled National Apostasy, which got copied and read controversially all over the church. It was ostensibly against the so-called reform of the secularizing of the church, of the Church of Ireland by Parliament, but it was actually against the whole way in which the politics of the time had taken over the church and secularized it. And then after that great sermon started things off, they started a regular series of publications, these leaders, called the Tracts for the Times, that got very widely read by people who hated them and by people who loved them. Both and. The Tracts for the Times, that's why they're also called the Tractarians, this part of the movement. Polemics, dissertations pushing for restoration of pure Catholicism of the Church of England. These were amplified in sermons, in books, and in a great deal of private conversation. Some leaders here now, I'll actually name them. John Keble, I just mentioned, who died in 1866. He was the preacher of the inaugural sermon of the movement, National Apostasy. Professor of poetry at Oxford, a parish priest, and a very popular religious poet. He published a long book of his poems called The Christian Year, which was almost the best-selling religious book in England in the 19th century. Which almost no one reads anymore. He was the editor of Richard Hooker, the 16th century theologian, of Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Well, I can't go into that. It's fairly complicated how he did that. He was a solid Anglican high churchman, an experienced and devoted parish pastor. He didn't see himself as the leader of a party in the church, but he was a deeply holy man in his personal life and in all the influence he had around him, and a tremendous spiritual example. In some contrast to him was a very young priest named Hurrell Froude, who died very early in the movement in 1836. Very young, very provocative, always wanting to be on the outside edge of their criticism of everything. A wild flinger of questions, accusations, and radical opinions. He was passionate for deep insight and of an ascetic approach to God, in which people turned away from the kind of two-bottle churchmanship to something that was more austere and more pointed towards God. He died of tuberculosis early in the movement. He had kept a journal, and John Henry Newman made a mistake and published that journal under the title Remains. it was embarrassing to the movement because Newman had been naive about how Froude's advanced asceticism would be viewed in Victorian society, which wasn't ready for any part of that. Fasting in 19th century England, if you were middle or upper class, forget it. He was also very violently opposed to the Reformation in any form. He wanted to rehabilitate the most authoritarian Catholic Pope in history, which was Gregory VII, as the great icon of the church. Not many people followed him in that. John Henry Newman, who dies in 1890, was by far the greatest leader of the party. A brilliant intellect, a major preacher in Oxford. He had been born into an evangelical family, but at Oxford started out as part of the liberal group, centered around a professor named Richard Whately. Hurrell Froude thought at that point in his life that Newman was a heretic. However, he underwent a fairly rapid disillusionment with that and moved into a high church development, persuaded by and then becoming the greatest exponent of the Oxford movement. He was a great preacher. His sermons can still be read with very great profit. He was vicar of one of the major parishes in Oxford, St. Mary's Church, which was almost the university church and a major platform. It's where people came to hear great sermons on Sunday, and they heard him. And he was enormously influential in the university and far beyond it. He was the intellectual and polemical driver of the movement. A little later, an Old Testament professor named Pusey, E.B. Pusey, who dies in 1882, who was a man of first-class intellectual power and deep spiritual passion, engaged in sound, serious Christianity. But his wife died. He became deeply depressed as a result of that and relatively ineffective as a leader, especially in the disillusionment following Newman's defection to the Roman Catholic Church. Now, it's after 12:30, so I'm going to ask if there are questions, and I'll take up with the Oxford movement with its basic principles and what it was really after and what they were trying to do, and then its outcomes that have transformed the liturgy of the church. The very vestments that we see our priests wear at the communion table, at the altar, and we call it an altar, and we couldn't have done that before. And the very vestments were all growing out of this movement and have become almost universal in the Episcopal Church. Are there questions?
I don't want to just get too much people in the church, but was Henry VIII basically everything Protestant is that this? How much of that is actually the way it's now in the church later?
Well, I think Henry VIII essentially nationalized the Church of England, kind of like the way United Fruit Company got nationalized in Central America. Mm-hmm. They just changed the logos and changed some of the officers and left everything else pretty much the same. So under Henry VIII, England was still clearly a Catholic country. He made some small changes, but not many. The main thing he did was kick out the Pope and then close the monasteries, which had an enormous amount of power in the land. So I think the Oxford movement would have been very happy with a church not so dominated by Henry VIII by any means, but with the kind of religion that it represented. I think they would have liked that. What they did not want was a church under his son, Edward VI, which intentionally destroyed the whole Catholic side of Anglicanism and created a purely Protestant way of coming at things. That they did not like. That's back in the 16th century.
Having been a vicar in England, one of the things we had to combat all the time is people thinking that the church was supported by the state. It is not.
Not a bit.
Not a bit. And like you say, they still have their glebe lands and stuff. But one time I was visiting a friend in Swinton, and I said, "How large is your church?" He said, 39,000. I said, "Well, let me ask it another way. How many people come to church on Sunday?" He said about 35. But they're still expected to do all the baptisms and marriages and stuff, you know,
For everybody.
The church.
Mhm. I had, when I was assisting a vicar in the Church of England, he referred to a lot of the baptisms as cultural baptisms. And you could always tell when a funeral came from someone who actually came to church and considered himself or herself a serious Christian. At the funeral, he would say the Nunc Dimittis, "Lord, let thy servant depart in peace." If you didn't ever come to church, you didn't get the Nunc Dimittis.
I went to Evensong one Saturday evening in a small English town, and I met some people at their coffee hour, and I told them I was an Episcopal priest, and they were very interested in that. And I said, "So I'll wear my collar tomorrow to church," and they said, "Oh, don't." They probably won't. The vicar or the rector probably won't let you in. So I was very torn. However, I went in a blue shirt and I did not mention my fabulous relationship to the Episcopal Church.
Well, now you could.
Well, it depends on the town.
It does depend upon the particular church, congregation still. That is certainly the case. But with a number of women who are bishops in the Church of England now, things really have changed substantially. And
I wore a collar in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. So
at Windsor. Well, if you can do it there, you can do it pretty much anywhere.
Just a piece of trivia, when I was going to undergrad school, there were groups that we called Newman's, or a Newman Center was associated. Is this any relation here?
Yes, John Henry Newman converted to Roman Catholicism. We'll get into that in our next session. And became a very influential Roman Catholic on the liberal side of Roman Catholicism, sort of ironically. And so the university centers for Roman Catholic students, if they're allowed to name themselves anything, they'll normally name themselves the Newman Center in his memory, kind of like the way in which the great Jewish Rabbi Hillel, who was kind of a liberal rabbi back at the beginning of the Rabbinic Judaism, the Hillel Foundation or the Hillel Center is the way in which the Jewish religious centers are normally named in universities to this day. So Newman Center means normally a Roman, certainly always means a Roman Catholic group of students.
Maybe this is for next week, but what's the difference between the terms Anglo-Catholic, Oxford Movement, High Church? There's one I'm forgetting in there. Yeah, I mean, and well, I guess Tractarians you've explained, but and also maybe for next week, it's a two-part question. Their focus on the poor.
That will come next week.
Okay, so
Um,
Tractarian, I mean, High Church, Oxford Movement, Anglo-Catholic, is there a difference or?
Well,
what are they?
there's,
What do they mean?
terms overlap hugely and are used in a kind of very elastic way ordinarily. I'd say High Church is a somewhat distinct group of which the Oxford Movement is a part. There were High Church Anglicans in America, for example, who did not like a lot of the developments of Anglo-Catholicism. They wouldn't go with the new vestments and religious orders and things like that were growing up so rapidly in the wake of the Oxford Movement. The Oxford Movement itself really stops in many respects with the defection of Newman to Rome. The Oxford Movement, its ideals continue strongly in the Church of England, but it's not a movement anymore with a clear leader the way Newman had been. In England, you can be a sort of Tractarian, High Church, Oxford Movement person without actually belonging to the Oxford Movement as such. If you're an Anglo-Catholic in England, that means you're higher than that, by and large. There are some Anglican churches that say Mass in Latin. There are not many, but there are some. There's a Benedictine Abbey, Anglican Benedictine Abbey, Nasham Abbey, that is indistinguishable from any Roman Catholic Benedictine Abbey, absolutely indistinguishable. That's Anglo-Catholic. And here it means more generally just part of this whole movement. At least that's the way I've heard it. Okay, that's it for today. Next week, what happens? What grows out of this? Where it's coming from, but what happens and what grows out of this? That leads to what we get to do at St. Luke's, which would not have been possible without it. Let's check that out next week.
Thank you, Father
Thank
Bill.
you.
Thank you.
See you later.